Hey there, it's Amy from thecrazycraftlady.com. Next time you're at Dollar Tree, be sure to grab a few of these bamboo cutting boards. They are fantastic to craft with. They're one of my favorite craft blanks at the dollar store. And in today's video, I'm going to show you 15, yes, that's right, 15 different ways to craft with these bamboo cutting boards. Okay, so for this craft, you're going to want to start out with 2 bamboo cutting boards and some plain white Rust-Oleum chalk paint. You're going to paint the entire front surface of both bamboo cutting boards with white chalk paint. You can also paint around the edges, but we're going to do a second coat of blue paint, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want solid coverage of white on one surface of each cutting board because we're going to decoupage a napkin on top of it. So for this, we're going to do my Mod Podge and heat press method, which is nothing new if you've watched any of my videos. This was just regular Mod Podge. A lot of times I use matte because it's what I have, but I grabbed a couple of little tubes of this at Dollar Tree. So a solid coat of Mod Podge, let it dry, and then separate your napkins. A viewer shared this tip with me where you just take 2 pieces of painter's tape, one on each side of the napkin, and you can peel apart the layers. Super smart, so thank you. And then you're just going to heat press your napkin down using a mini heat press, which I will link to below, or if you don't have one, use an iron with no steam, and just protect the surface of your napkin with a piece of parchment paper. I got this napkin at TJ Maxx. Whenever I'm at places like TJ Maxx and I see the clearance aisles at Target or whatever, I try to grab cute napkins when I can. They're great for entertaining or for seasonal meals like Easter or Christmas or whatever, and then save a couple leftover ones for crafting. And then once that napkin had been heat pressed on, I just used a little nail file to separate all the edges. So this way you don't have to cut the napkin down to size and worry about centering it perfectly. Heat press it first, then use a nail file or like a piece of sandpaper or a sandpaper block to sand around all the edges and remove all that excess napkin there. And then just for extra layer of protection, I go back and I reheat press the edges in case anything got lifted while I was sanding it away with that nail file. And then I came in with this Folk Art matte paint. It's the color French Blue. It just matched my napkin, so use whatever color works for you that matches, whatever napkin or decoupage paper or printable or whatever you want to add to your bookend here. And then I also painted the whole back surface with that same blue paint. This is the back surface that's going to face the books for the bookend, but it's nice to have everything finished and have a polished look. And then it's time to come in with these jumbo craft sticks. So I used 5 of them because that matched the width of the bottom of the cutting board. I measured them so that they were split exactly in half, and then I used my miter shears to cut them all in half. You could also use heavy-duty craft scissors or a saw if you have one, but I find miter shears to be the easiest when working with popsicle sticks. And then I used my combination of E6000 and hot glue to attach 5 wooden craft stick halves to the bottom of each cutting board. So the E6000 gives that permanent hold that you want. The hot glue gives that instant hold so your popsicle sticks aren't falling down. I did that on both cutting boards, and then I also secured with an extra line of hot glue along that seam between the craft sticks and the cutting board. And then I went ahead and painted the craft sticks with that same light blue chalk paint that I used for the rest of the project. But once again, use whatever color paint matches the napkin that you're using. And then I had this little hardware piece left over. I had bought a pack of them for a previous furniture update thing. So this is optional, or you can add any type of tag or hardware that you like. So I just marked the holes with a pencil, and then I used my pin vise tool. Start on the very smallest setting and then work your way up. I think I used 2 or 3 different drill bits on this. Be very careful because the bamboo can split if you go up in size too fast. So always start with the smallest drill bit first. And then I just added back in the little screws to attach my decorative hardware there. And then since there was room for a label, I decided to pull up my stamps and some creamy colored cardstock there. And I just stamped a little word. I think I did fiction on one side and books on the other or something. But this will totally depend on what type of hardware or embellishment you want to add to yours. Feel free to get creative and do whatever you like. Then that's it. Here are my 2 finished little bookends. I think they're super cute. I'm really happy with how they turned out, and I can't wait to see how they hold up over time. At Hobby Lobby, they have, it's called a candle cup. It's in the unfinished wood section with the wood pile stuff. I'm not sure why it's called a candle cup. I think they make cute little feet, so I just grabbed some E6000 glue and glued them right onto the bottom of my cutting board in each of the 4 corners. And then I just grabbed some chalk paint and I painted the whole thing this nice cream off-white color. I think this is the color Parchment from Folk Art. But I just used a 1-inch flat paintbrush to paint the whole thing. And then I let it completely dry. And then moved on to my next step, which is adding painter's tape so I can paint some lines. So this is just 1-inch blue painter's tape. Create 1 line on each side, and then I used my nonstick scissors to cut a piece of tape in half, lengthwise or hot dog style, I guess, and then add those 2 in the middle. And this is going to create kind of a grain sack pattern. So super farmhouse cottage-y style going on here. And then once that tape is in place, use some navy blue chalk paint and a very dry brush technique. So I do not want solid perfect lines. I want more of a distressed paint finish on this. So use very little bit of paint on a dry brush. And then while the paint is still wet, carefully just peel away your tape and you'll have nice crisp lines. And then I just added some handles. So these are just black, like hardware handles from Home Depot or whatever. And I didn't have black screws. I only had silver screws, so I made it work. So just a 1/4-inch wood screw is the perfect size. Because these cutting boards are about a 1/4 inch thick, you may have to adjust depending on, I guess, the size of your hardware, but your good rule of thumb is about a 1/4 inch. And then I just marked off my pilot holes, and then I used this handy pin vise tool. I ordered it off Amazon, I'll link to it below. But that just made my pilot holes, so then I could screw the wood screws in to secure my hardware in place. And then because I didn't have black screws, I only had silver screws, I had to come back with a little bit of black chalk paint and paint the tops of my screws black just so they match my hardware. But that's it, a cute little decorative tray. Okay, friends, please bear with me on this craft. This is probably the most involved with the most amount of steps craft that I've made in quite some time, but I'm obsessed with the end result. I promise it's worth it. So I grabbed a dollar store bamboo cutting board and some Folk Art wood tint in the color walnut. It's a very dark stain. You got to be real careful when you stain bamboo because bamboo's not going to want to absorb the stain, but I didn't want just the unfinished bamboo look on this, and I didn't want to paint it. I wanted it to look like a natural wood. So I ended up doing a front coat and then a back coat, and make sure you don't leave any drippy spots or weird paint lines because it's very finicky. Just be very patient and make sure before you step away to let the stain dry, you have all your brush strokes the way that you like them and no weird spots. And then I wasn't thrilled with how dark this was, so I actually went back and I did a second coat of the wood stain, and I was very happy with how that turned out. So I'm glad I did that. And then we're going to use some air dry clay. So another dollar store cutting board. These are the cutting board mats, and I found this really perfect for rolling out my air dry clay. So I just grabbed a little chunk of clay here. A little goes a long way. I think I only used maybe like a fourth of this package, and this whole package was like $3.50 at Hobby Lobby. Very inexpensive. So I actually used 2 paint sticks as my guide for the thickness when I rolled out the air dry clay, which was really helpful. And then I also put a self-healing cutting mat underneath that cutting, like chopping mat, because the chopping mat is kind of translucent, so you can still see the grid underneath, which is great for making a perfectly square, perfectly rectangular shape. So I had to kind of finagle it a little bit. I'm not the expert. You can tell I don't make pastries. I don't roll pastry dough like ever. I kept flipping it over to get like a smoother side, and then I decided, okay, how big do I want this compared to the size of my cutting board? Then I just grabbed a really sharp little knife there, and I cut all the edges to make just a rectangle with rounded edges. So I've been going down a deep rabbit hole of videos on Pinterest and Instagram of people doing like plaster cast botanical impressions where they roll botanicals into like clay and then they do a cast, and it's like a whole thing. They're super fun to watch. So that was my inspiration for this craft. I just grabbed some inexpensive flowers. This is baby's breath. I think I got these at Sam's Club actually because I didn't have time to go to Trader Joe's. Normally I go to Trader Joe's, but it's kind of far away. And I just layered in a bunch of flowers. So I did a test piece on this. Most of my crafts, I just wing it and you get what you get, but I actually did a test project on this one. And the first one, I didn't do nearly enough flowers. So go real heavy on the flowers, let them overlap. It's totally fine. The more, the better. And then once I had all my flowers in place, I grabbed a piece of parchment paper. I smoothed it over the air dry clay, and I just gave it a nice roll with my rolling pin so that those flowers were really smushed. That's a very technical term, smushed into the clay. So then from here, it's time to pull everything out because we're just going to leave the shape of the imprint of the flowers. So I just peeled away whatever flowers I could. And then the baby's breath kind of made a mess. So I just grabbed some tweezers and I very carefully plucked out any little stray bits, or I used the end of my sharp knife there. It only took a few minutes. And then I was impatient to let this dry. So I peeled this off my cutting mat and I set it on a piece of parchment paper. And I saw this hack on Pinterest or something where you put it into a cold oven, set the oven to 200 degrees, let it sit for 20 minutes, and then pop it out. On my test subject, it ended up being, I left it to between bakes. I think I baked it 3 times at this method. Between bakes, I left it sitting on the parchment paper, just straight on the cookie sheet, and it puffed up and a lot of moisture collected underneath it on the parchment paper. You can also see here, I did not do nearly enough flowers. So if you do this, take it off the cookie sheet and put it onto a drying rack between bakes. And then it's time to add your hardware. I just used some eye hooks on the back, or just one eye hook on the back of my cutting board. Use my pin vise tool to very carefully drill my pilot holes. Start with the smallest drill bit and work your way up. And then I use just a tiny little hammer to hammer in those 2 nails. You could also, if you don't want to hammer into this, you could also use Velcro command strip hooks on the back and it'll stick right on your wall. And then I added these 3 little black hooks. I got them at Hobby Lobby. If I had to do this again, I would not do nails, I would do screws, and you will see why. So I used my ruler to measure out where I wanted to put my 3 hooks. And then I used my pin vise tool to start screwing my pilot holes, which is totally fine. And I've had no problem screwing screws into these bamboo cutting boards. But once I started hammering the nails in on my first test project, the bamboo split. completely split straight through the project. I was very sad, very frustrated, and I had to step away for the night. It was late at night, and I was like, okay, this is a problem for tomorrow, Amy, not today, Amy. And then I just added my dried, air-dried clay with E6000 right to the bamboo cutting board. So this is my decoration for my little wall hooks. And then you'll see here, even with the nails and all the trouble they gave me, the hooks were still really wonky. And maybe it's because I was super cautious and drilled the pilot holes too big. So I just reinforced the back of each of those hooks with a little E6000 glue. I think maybe in the future I would just start with the E6000 glue, put tiny little screws in. I don't know. And then I had to paint the fronts of my little nails black because I used silver nails. I didn't have tiny black nails, so I just used a little bit of chalk paint there. But that's it, my cute little hanging wall hook. I kind of wanted to hang it by the front door, but I'm like, this is too delicate and pretty for our nasty dog leashes, so I think I'm gonna have to find a different place for it. First thing I did was just apply a light base coat of black chalk paint. This is Decor home decor chalk paint, but any type of black chalk paint or even black acrylic craft paint would work. And I didn't want to do full coverage, so I just kind of used a dry brush technique. So just dip a 1-inch flat paintbrush in the paint, then kind of dab off the excess and use very light brush strokes. And you're going to cover most of the center, so what really matters is that the edge parts have the paint coverage or the finish that you really want. And then also paint all the way around the edges of your little wooden cutting board or your scrap wood or whatever you're painting on. And then once that is dried, I used a piece of scrap of paper that had music print on it, or if you have like an old hymnal or sheet music that you want to upcycle, have at it. I just kind of creased the paper with the edge of the cutting board and then ripped the paper. So I had kind of a straight edge. I didn't want to cut it though, because I didn't want it to be perfectly, like a perfectly straight edge. I wanted it ripped on all 4 edges to look a little bit more distressed. So I just ripped that paper down to size on all 4 sides and kind of around the edges so that it was about a 1/2 inch smaller than the cutting board in all directions. From there, I grabbed some matte Mod Podge. I like using matte on these projects. And I applied a nice even coat all over the front of that cutting board. And then just smoothed down my piece of sheet music scrap paper right on top, smooth out any bubbles. This is a small project, so I was just able to smooth everything out with my fingertips. And I kind of let that dry for maybe 15-20 minutes and then came back and sealed the whole thing again with another solid coat of matte Mod Podge. But before I let that dry, I actually pulled out some silver glitter, and I very rarely use glitter. It's just not my jam, too messy. But for this, I thought it would look really cute to have just a glitter border on this sign, just for something a little different. And then I cleaned up my work surface. I recently ordered this little miniature desktop vacuum off Amazon, and it's been super handy cleaning up my work surface when I'm working with messy things like glitter. So I will link to that below. And then I grabbed a bunch of these little half wood balls. I also ordered these on Amazon and will link to them below. I've used them on a ton of projects. They're super fun to work with. And then I just did that same dry brush technique with a smaller flat paintbrush and left a little bit of that wood grain poking through. In all honesty, if I had to do this project over again, I would probably use even less black paint so that it looked even more weathered and more of that wood grain was poking through. These ended up being a little darker than I would have liked. But once all that paint was dry, I then just dry fit my little half wood balls onto the sign once the Mod Podge had dried. And I always like to dry fit these first just to get the spacing right. And then I use wood glue with a fine point paintbrush. So I like using wood glue because it gives me a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more work time than if I was using hot glue, because it takes a minute to dry. So I'm able to kind of, even though I've dry fit everything in place, I can then set the wood beads in place and then kind of move them around until I get the exact spacing that I like. But there was my little snowman shape, and then to finish it off, I just embellished with some baker's twine and some floral wire that's like covered in brown craft paper. You could use any type of ribbon or twine, whatever works. I just kind of paired these two together. That baker's twine has a little bit of silver floss running through it, so it kind of pairs well with the glitter. Wrap that around a few times and then secure it in the back with hot glue. And then I also added a little bow at the snowman's neck just for a little bit more embellishment, but that was it. For this craft, you just want to start with a bamboo cutting board and some plain white Rust-Oleum chalk paint. This is my go-to chalk paint for everything. And you're just going to paint the whole thing. So front, edges, and back. Just make sure you get nice even coverage. If you need to do a second coat, you can do that as well after the first coat dries. And then I went into Cricut Design Space. I try not to do too many Cricut projects on here because I know not everyone has access to a Cricut, but I saw this little bathroom pattern and I decided to cut it out on just plain black adhesive vinyl. Here are the dimensions I cut it at in Cricut Design Space. For whatever reason, the two elements came separated and I thought it was just easier to put them back together once I cut it than it was in Design Space because I was being lazy. So I just trimmed it down, used some painter's tape to put the other letters where they belonged. And then I just grabbed my transfer tape and transferred the entire decal onto the sign. So I chose black because I'm going for kind of like a faux enamelware type sign. I've done some faux enamelware on other projects, but never a sign, so I'm excited about this. But then once I got the decal transferred over, I just measured about 2 inches from each side of the cutting board edge there with a pen. And then I used my pin vise tool, and be patient, it takes a minute. So I started with my smallest drill bit, I guess, and drilled 2 little holes in the top where I'd marked with my pen, and then you move up to a larger drill bit. The pin vise tool I just feel is easiest on these small projects, but if you have a drill and want to very carefully drill a pilot hole, you're welcome to do so. And then I just grabbed 2 eye hooks. Now, I should have used black eye hooks, but I only have a packet of like a bajillion silver eye hooks. So to quote my latest favorite Instagram, like food Instagrammer, I think she's in Canada, she's like, we use what we have. So we use what we have. So instead of going out and buying something extra, I just used silver, screwed those little eye hooks into place, and then I just painted them black. So we're actually going to use plain black chalk paint and a little fine point paintbrush, and you're going to paint all the way around the edge of the cutting board. Paint those eye hooks while you're at it. And so I want this to be kind of like a messy, worn enamelware look. So I painted all the way around the edge, and then I let it kind of overlap along the front as well. So you'll see here as I go along, I kind of let my line get wavy and kind of follow the paint wherever it wants to go. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And then I also, to make the back look nice, we always want to finish the back of our projects, I just did the exact same thing on the back as well. And then my problem with these types of projects is that I never know when to stop painting. Like Amy, just step away from the paintbrush, right? So I added a few little worn areas where it looks like the enamelware, I can say it, might be naturally worn. So just set it down, take a step back, say, do I like how this looks? And when in doubt, just stop painting because you'll overdo it. I once had a project that ended up looking like a spotted cow pattern and I had to chuck the whole thing. But then I just finished the whole thing off with some black wire. So this is actually not floral wire. I wanted black wire for another project, and I got this in the jewelry section. So if you're not finding the floral wire that you want, check the jewelry section at the craft store. But just run that through each end of the eye hook, give it a twist there, and then you can simply hang this sign. I think I'm going to hang this on our guest bathroom on the main level in our house because I think it's kind of cute. For this craft, you'll want to start with a cutting board and one of those little mini wood crates that they normally have in the craft section at Dollar Tree. You're just going to glue the wood crate to the bottom of the cutting board. So I just apply a bit of wood glue, and then because I'm an impatient crafter, a tiny bit of hot glue, and then quickly pop that crate right onto the cutting board. So the hot glue allows me to move on to the next step right away, but the wood glue gives me the long-term hold that I want. And then I grabbed my handy dandy half wood balls. I use these on all sorts of craft projects. I will link to them. They're also in my Amazon storefront where I keep a running list of my most popular, most used craft supplies. But I just dry fit the little half wood balls around the edge of the cutting board and the base of that wood crate. I like to dry fit them first just to make sure I get the spacing the way I want it, and then back with that wood glue, and I like to use a paintbrush just so I have better control over where the wood glue is going, and then just glue all of those little wood beads in place. The benefit of using the wood glue is, one, you get the best hold, and two, as you're putting these in place, you can kind of wiggle the little wood beads around to, if they're not exactly perfectly spaced. Sometimes you glue stuff in place and then you look back at it and it's like, maybe I want to scooch these over a little bit. So a little bit time consuming, but I think worth it. And I really love the look of the row of half wood balls. And then once all that wood glue had dried, I came in with some chalk paint. So this first color, I'm going to layer a couple different colors. The first color here is Folk Art Matte Paint in the color Parchment. It's a beautiful, like off-white, creamy, but not yellowy, beautiful matte paint color. I am really enjoying using it on a lot of projects, but just a full coverage base coat all over the project. And then I also layered in a little bit of Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint in the color Barely Pink, just to kind of warm up that cream, and also because I'm going to be using pink flowers that you'll see later in this tutorial. And then to distress it, just grabbed a little bit of Folk Art matte paint in the color Coffee Bean. Very dry brush technique here, just a tiny bit of brown paint on that same brush that I used for the cream and the pink. And you can layer as much or as little as you like. And if you add too much brown paint, you can always pick up some more cream or some more pink and layer it in. And then whatever paint I had left over in my paint tray, I applied to the back of the project just so the back would be just as finished and beautiful as the front. And then I also kind of, before the paint fully dried, I stippled just a little bit with that same brush just so that the finish wasn't as streaky and a little bit more softened, I guess. Then once all that paint had dried, I just grabbed a piece of styrofoam. This is from Dollar Tree, craft store, whatever. I just cut a little piece that would fit into that wood crate. And it gets messy. Sorry, I don't know any way around it. And then hot glue that piece of styrofoam right into the crate. It doesn't have to fit perfectly. There can be some empty space around it. And then I just went into my craft stash. This is some spring greenery. I think it's a stem that I bought at Walmart last year, maybe. Just filled a nice base of greenery for then your flowers to go into. And then these flowers are, I think, some leftover from Dollar Tree from the bicycle wheel wreath I made last spring, as well as some baby's breath from Michael's leftover from a speckled Easter egg wreath that I made last year. I just had a tiny little bit of these light pink flowers that I wanted to use up. And then I just went into Cricut Design Space and I found this Fresh Flower Market cut file. If you do not have a Cricut, feel free. They have like rub-on transfers at the craft store, at Dollar Tree, or you could freehand something or use a sticker or a printable even. A printable would be a great idea. Mod Podge a printable onto this. But I just cut this out onto white vinyl and y'all, this was like I should not have cut this file this small. The weeding and the transferring, it tested my skills, although I don't have like the best Cricut skills, but it was definitely time and labor intensive to not lose any of the tiny little pieces and get everything weeded and transferred properly. But in the end, I think it was worth it because I really love this little graphic or this text that I put onto this project. I think it really finishes it off nicely. But there you have it, a cute little flower market wooden crate of silk flowers for spring, perfect for any, spring decor or bookshelf, or I might even like use this as a bookend or something. We'll see. Okay, for this craft, we're going to use my tried and true method for printing on tissue paper. This is a great way to Mod Podge free printables and other images onto your projects. So I just cut a piece of regular gift wrap tissue paper to about an inch smaller than an 8.5 by 11 sheet of printer paper. So you want a nice flat piece with as few wrinkles as possible. And then you're going to grab your painter's tape or your masking tape and you're going to tape it around all the way, all four edges, nice and smooth. You don't want any rough edges poking up, so you want to smooth the tape perfectly flat and just get as smooth of a surface as possible because you are going to run this through your printer. I will say my first few tries doing this method were not perfect, but I've since kind of gotten the hang of it. Sometimes you have to hold the paper as it feeds through the tray. But a little practice, and I promise you'll get quite proficient, and you can do all sorts of Mod Podge projects on tissue paper. So I just ran this through my printer. I have an Epson EcoTake printer, and I can individually fill the different colors of ink, which is amazing. No more cartridges. Shout out, not sponsored. Love this printer. So I just printed a little Christmas postcard here. So you can tell we're going to make a postcard craft. So once again, like 90% of my projects, plain white Rust-Oleum chalk paint, a solid coat, front, edge, and back of the cutting board. You can see I spritzed it with a little bit of water there. Sometimes chalk paint gets a little thick as you are painting, so you can thin it out with some water to make it more spreadable. Then let that paint completely dry, and then add a coat of Mod Podge, any type of Mod Podge. I think this was matte, regular gloss will work too. Just a nice, generous coat of Mod Podge on each side, because we're going to decorate both sides, you'll see here, and let it dry completely. And this is how you get no bubbles with your tissue paper. So you'll see I also made a Valentine little postcard. So these are free printables. I will link to them below in the video description. You can just print these off or design your own, whatever you like, right? I made these in Canva. It was pretty simple. So I cut the Valentine postcard down to size, and then I just heat pressed it right back on. So that Mod Podge is dry and you want to reactivate it. So by setting the tissue paper down first and then a sheet of parchment paper to protect your surface. And then I use a mini heat press. If you don't have one, you can use an iron with no steam. And then iron all the way across that printable there, and that's going to reactivate the Mod Podge. And so you get perfect, smooth decoupage finish, no bubbles, and no mess. And then I repeated the exact same process with my Christmas postcard on the other side. And then I just felt that these looked a little unfinished, and I'm not sure how I feel about this. So if you want to leave me a comment and let me know what you think, my feelings will not be hurt. I distressed with a little bit of chalk paint. So sometimes on these projects, instead of using a paintbrush, I use a tiny piece of a clean dish sponge. And so on the Valentine one, I did a little bit of like moss green Waverly chalk paint, and then I did a little like blush pink chalk paint as well. You'll want to pick colors, that complement whatever printable you're using or whatever. But you'll see it started to rip up my tissue paper on the edge, so I'm not thrilled about that. I was able to reheat press it down, no problem, no harm, no foul. But I'm still not sure that it was worth the effort. And then on the Christmas postcard, I just did a little bit of green chalk paint as well as a bit of taupe paint. Like I said, completely optional. I think maybe I could have gone with more of a metallic edge and painted gold around the edge. That maybe would have been a better look. I'm not sure. Like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But that's it. So this is a reversible craft. I'm really getting into the reversible multi-purpose, so you can use it from Christmas all the way through Valentine's Day, and that's it. All right, so for this craft, we're going to use some tumbling tower pieces. So I think I used 10 of them. Arrange them on one side of a bamboo cutting board, all from Dollar Tree. Kind of dry fit them in place so that they're evenly spaced. There's no gaps between them. It's centered on your cutting board in a little rectangular shape there. And then I just used a little bit of wood glue on a paintbrush to secure all of those tumbling tower pieces in place. So we're going to make a riser tray, and this is not the first riser tray I've made with a dollar store bamboo cutting board, but this time we're going to use the Jenga pieces as the elevation for this instead of adding like feet or something to it. And then you're going to flip the cutting board over and we're going to add a little wood bead edge details, like a bobbin detail. So once again, dry fit everything first. This takes a little bit of time, but I like to dry fit everything so you know you have your spacing correct before you start gluing, because I don't want to get to the end and only have room for, half a wood bead, because then everything's going to look odd. These are just 15 millimeter half wood balls. I order on Amazon. Then same thing as with the tumbling tower pieces, you're just going to add a dab of wood glue to the back of each little wooden half ball, secure it in place. The nice thing about the wood glue is it doesn't dry instantly, so you can set the little wood balls in place and then kind of move them around to make sure that the spacing is exactly how you want it. Then once all that wood glue is dried, come back with plain white Rust-Oleum chalk paint. This is a nice base coat primer, and paint the whole project, all the way around the bottom, the edge, and then the top part. The bobbin detail with the little half wood balls, not gonna lie, it's a little tricky getting in all the nooks and crannies. So you kind of use a pouncing motion with your paintbrush at all angles. So you want to come at it from all different angles so you can rotate your project several times and look at it from different sides to make sure you get in all the nooks and crannies. And then from here, I kind of played around a bit. So I used a combination of folk art matte paint in the color Mossy Meadow, which is that green there. That's what I put on first, as well as Villa Green, which is that teal. I wanted to create kind of like a mossy, like a teal mossy textured effect. I like how it turned out. I don't really know how to describe it. I don't have a name for it. But then that brown paint is called folk art matte paint in the color Coffee Bean. So the first thing I did is I did a layer of that green and teal paint all over the whole thing, in all the nooks and crannies, around the little wood half balls, and then on the flat surface. I brushed back and forth, and then I also kind of pounced to make it look weathered and textured. And then I did not wait for that to dry. I went back in with that brown paint. I actually softened it up with a little bit of the teal paint, mixed it together, and very kind of dry brushed, weathered, and textured the surface of the tray. And then I wanted this to be waterproof because I want to be able to use this next to a sink. So I used my hard coat Mod Podge, which is like dishwasher safe, and it'll be waterproof. So once again, all the nooks and crannies, all the different angles. It takes a minute, but it's worth it. And then here's my finished craft. It's a little riser tray you could put. This is a larger bottle of soap, so you could put soap on it, or a smaller soap and lotion combo next to like a guest bathroom sink. I think would be a great idea. So we're gonna do a layered paint technique. So I start with just brown. I think this is Folk Art Matte in Coffee Bean. Any brown acrylic craft paint will work. I like to use a 1-inch flat paintbrush and a very dry brush technique. So a little bit of paint, pounce it off, and use long brush strokes up and down on your surface. I also did the same thing on the little mini wooden crate and make sure to get like the top ridge and the nooks and crannies around those handles as well. Then I layered in some cream paint. This is the color Parchment. It's that same matte paint. Any cream will do. Same thing, long brush strokes, dry brush technique. And I wasn't loving this color as much as I thought I would. because I'm going to do black lettering on it, I wanted my black to really pop, so I ended up going back in with just some plain white chalk paint to brighten it up a little bit, but I'm really glad I used the cream as well, because it makes for a nice layered, weathered paint finish. You could also, I think it would be really beautiful to layer in maybe some green paint on something like this. I've done that in the past on different projects. Layer in some brown, some green, and then some white or cream. That could be really fun too. But once all that paint had dried, I just went in with some wood glue on the back of the wooden crate. So you notice I didn't paint that back surface of the wooden crate. Wood glue for permanent hold, hot glue for instant quick hold, and just center that crate right at the bottom of your cutting board. And then pop in a few pieces of styrofoam or craft foam into that mini crate there. And then from here, I printed this off on my Cricut in black vinyl, Farm Fresh Christmas trees. If you don't have a Cricut, you could paint on lettering. You could use an image transfer, rub-on transfer from Dollar Tree, or there are a ton of different options on Amazon. I kind of thought about where I wanted to place my trees and how tall they would be, and I decided that with this decal, I would need to place it right at the very top of my cutting board so that the words wouldn't be covered up by my Christmas trees. So I just used a little bit of transfer tape here, peeled off that paper backing from my vinyl, and then just smoothed my vinyl cutout right there at the top of the cutting board. Sometimes it's a little tricky on these smaller projects. I wouldn't cut this vinyl much smaller than this on these letters because otherwise it gets too tricky to weed and transfer. But with a little bit of patience and practice, it works out. I've done this before on other projects. I did a spring flower mini crate as well, doing something very similar, which I will link to. But once I had that vinyl transferred, it's time to fill your little crate. So to cover up the styrofoam, I just ripped some scraps of burlap. You could also use ribbon, scrap fabric, drop cloth fabric would be great, but just a little bit of burlap in each of the four corners. And then I ended up using 5 bottle brush Christmas trees in total and just pressed them right into that craft foam. And the bottle brush trees are different sizes, so you want to stagger them so that they're all at different heights, and then just use your best judgment to place them at whatever height that you think looks best. But I just used 5 little bottle brush trees inside that mini wood crate, and I thought that worked out really well. And then just to finish it off, I used some black and white check ribbon and I wrapped it around that crate. And I just very simply secured it in the back, both ends, with hot glue. And then finally, I finished it off with my simple, I use my bunny ears method. So 2 bunny ears and then tie them in a knot to make a simple little bow. Cut the tail ends at a 45-degree angle and then hot glue that bow right in place on the center of the little mini wood crate there. And then here's your finished miniature Christmas tree farm craft. This craft I just started with a little wooden mini crate from Dollar Tree. Fun fact, these have gotten smaller over time. I don't know, shrinkflation, whatever it is. This is a little bit smaller than previous, like by half an inch, quarter of an inch maybe. Anyway, painted it white with white chalk paint. And then I also painted the whole cutting board white as well. I didn't do like perfect coverage. I went more for maybe a distressed look. It just didn't have to be perfect. If a little bit of wood is showing through, that's fine. If you want to sand it too, that's a great option if you want to kind of rough up the edges. Let everything dry, and then I just use my combination of wood glue and hot glue. The wood glue gives you that permanent long-term hold that you're looking for, and hot glue for the instant hold so I can move on with the next steps of this craft. And then I just took a pencil and a ruler and I measured the midpoint of both the wood crate and the cutting board. This way I could make paint lines, or tape lines, excuse me, painter's tape lines for a grain set pattern. So then I measured a 1/2 inch on either side of that center point, which then would give me a 1 inch stripe in the center. So I initially started with painter's tape. I used my nonstick scissors and I just cut one piece of painter's tape right in half. And you place that on either side of your little tick mark so you have a 1-inch strip ready to be painted in the middle there. Be careful to always have your little pencil marks outside of the tape, not underneath the tape, so that they get painted over and you don't see them on the white paint. So I added tape lines to both the wood crate and the back of the cutting board there. And then I just kind of eyeballed the next little width and I used a full strip of paint. So you want, for the grain sack pattern, you want the thick strip in the middle and then 2 thinner strips, about, half or a third of the width of the thicker strip on either side. So I just taped that off. And then make sure to smooth down the tape really, really well so you get crisp paint lines. And then I just grabbed my 1-inch flat paintbrush and my red paint and very lightly painted within that tape. I didn't go for perfect coverage. I kind of wanted it to be more dry brush and a little bit more rustic looking. But then once all your paint has been applied, do not wait for the paint to dry because you'll get crisper paint lines if you very carefully peel away the tape while the paint is wet. So just kind of peel it away at an angle, and once you've peeled that tape away, make sure you keep the tape as far away from your project so that none of the extra paint from the tape gets anywhere near where it shouldn't be. But then once that paint had dried, I cut this little Land That I Love decal off my Cricut on navy blue. So I will, here are the screenshots, okay? First of all, here is, if you have a Cricut Design Space subscription, Land That I Love, take a screenshot, that's the code for it. And then I just made all of the elements on it one color, and then here are the dimensions that I made it. So you have to unlock the dimensions because I spread it a little wider than it originally was. But then I just kind of set that in place to think, okay, this is where I want this to be. How high do I want my flowers to go? So you want to fill that little box with flowers. I ran out of square or rectangular styrofoam, so I had to use little styrofoam balls. Use whatever you got. Just hot glue those in place so you have something for your flowers to stick into. For this, I used a faux eucalyptus pick that I just picked up at Walmart. Kind of cut some of the tops off those and start on the sides and then work your way to fill in. I use my heavy duty Fiskars craft scissors to cut through all that wire. For me, that's just the easiest way to do it. And just stick all those little mini eucalyptus or boxwood or whatever greenery that you like that matches your style. And then just fill that in. And then this is so late in the summer that they were all out of summer flowers at Dollar Tree and they already had fall stuff out, but luckily red is a fall color, so I just grabbed one sprig of these red fall florals and I just kind of stuck the tops. I just popped the tops right off and I only used one stem here, just the sprigs from one stem, and stuck those in within my eucalyptus leaves. And then to kind of fill in so you don't see any of the styrofoam, I just cut 4 little squares of burlap and I hot glued them into each of the 4 corners of the little wood crate. I just folded the square into a triangle and then a triangle again, and then carefully hot glued it into each of the corners. This is just to fill in any empty space between any of the greenery or the flowers, and so that none of the styrofoam shows through. And then to finish it off, I used that decal that I cut on my Cricut earlier, grabbed some transfer tape and smoothed the decal onto the back of the cutting board. So this is why it's so important to kind of dry fit it at first to make sure you know how high you want your flowers and your greenery to stick up so that it doesn't either cover part of your decal or be too low that there's a weird blank space below your decal. And then if you watch very closely here, you'll notice that as I peel away the transfer tape, the A on the word that didn't make it onto the cutting board, but luckily I noticed before I threw away the transfer tape and I was able to salvage it. So attention to detail, my friends. But that's it, my finished little Patriotic flower crate. Start by painting your cutting board with some chalk paint. This is folk art chalk paint in the color Antique Green. I debated between doing a dark green or a navy, but really any color that you like would work, but probably a darker color because we're going to stencil white on top of it. Also, if you can't find these bamboo cutting boards at Dollar Tree, this craft in particular could be made quite easily with just a piece of scrap wood. You do not need a cutting board. I just wanted to come up with a creative use for a cutting board, so here we are. So just a coat, and I kind of dry brushed it more towards the edges, let some of that wood grain poke through, and then I also painted the edges of the cutting board to make it finished, like a more finished look, and I also painted the back. I also added a very light second coat just in the middle because I wanted more solid coverage in the middle where my stencil was going to go, and then have it be more distressed around the edges. Then once that chalk paint had dried, I just grabbed my sanding block and I very lightly sanded the edges, just so a little bit more of that wood would poke through and to make this look more distressed. Then clean up all that dust, and then I grabbed a stencil. So this is a Wildflower stencil. I got a pack on Amazon and I love them, and I think I'll probably be crafting with them quite a bit. Just use some painter's tape to smooth down your stencil. And then I grabbed some more folk art chalk paint. This color is white Adirondack, but really any white chalk paint will do. And my pouncer brush, and then I just started on one side and I worked from right to left, pouncing straight up and down. It's really important that you don't use too much paint and that you go in a straight up and down motion just so that your stencil doesn't bleed and so that you have nice crisp paint lines when you remove the stencil. But just take your time, and then before you let the paint dry, while it's still a little bit wet, very carefully peel away that stencil. And if you did it right, you'll have a beautiful little wildflower pattern. And then it was time to hang my sign. So I just used a ruler and a Sharpie to mark 2 little dots on either side of the top of the cutting board, just so that they were evenly spaced. And then I finally got smart. Instead of having to pull out my power tools, I ordered this pin vise. It's just a tiny little screwdriver tool. And this way on small craft projects, I can drill little holes, little pilot holes for things like these screw eyes, which I will be using to hang the wood bead hanger here. So then just screw those little screw eyes into place. It gets a little trickier at the end, so I used my mini little screwdriver to get more leverage to completely tighten the screw eyes. And then I got this little garland at Dollar Tree. It's just unfinished wood beads on twine, or you could just string wood beads up on twine. But I just cut apart the garland here and I removed several wood beads just so that I would have enough twine on the tail ends to run those tail ends through the screw eyes and then secure them on the end with a double knot, and that's it. And then here you have a little miniature sign that you can hang really anywhere in your house, but I decided to hang this up in my kitchen for springtime. Okay, so dollar store sometimes sells things like seashells and sand and sea glass embellishments. So normally I've only seen these thicker sea glass pieces, but now I've seen these thinner sea glass slices. So I grabbed some sea glass slices and some seashells, and I thought I'd make a little nautical project. So I grabbed 2 dollar store bamboo cutting boards, and I started with just some plain white Rust-Oleum chalk paint that I really watered down. So that mug on the side, Christmas gift for my son, it has dogs on it. He got it at Sur La Table with his grandma. And then it has a tea steeper that looks like a wiener dog that hangs off the side of the mug. It is the most adorable thing ever. It makes me really happy. So that's what I just had a little water in a mug, and I really watered down the white Rust-Oleum chalk paint and really whitewashed the surface. And then I wasn't super happy, so I grabbed some gray chalk paint as well, and I really watered that down, and I added another layer, and I felt like this gave it a little bit more of a driftwood look and less of a bamboo look. You can really brush around. If it's getting too stripy, you can brush left and right first and then finish off with straight up and down brush strokes to get an even finish. But I just let that dry, and then I played around first with the sea glass and then with the seashells. I will say the sea glass was easier for me to arrange. I really doubted myself on the seashells. You'll see this in a minute. But I really wanted to create a specimen art feel here, so I just arranged the sea glass kind of like in a 4x4 pattern. Some sections had more pieces of sea glass because they were smaller. And then here's where it kind of fell apart. I really doubted myself on should the shells be face up or face down, and then I realized, well, the inside of the shell has the most detail and characteristic, but and like difference in color. The front outside part of the shell they were all the same, so I was like, that'd be really boring. But then I questioned my arrangement, and I had seen on Pinterest a thing where someone like put the seashells facing each other so it looked like a butterfly, but these shells weren't quite elongated enough to give the butterfly feel. So I just ended up doing a gradient pattern where anything that was solid white or yellowish went towards the top and the darker purple shells went towards the bottom. And then I just secured everything in place with E6000 glue, just the tiniest dab. You'll see this is the tiniest little tube of E6000, and there was only like a fourth of it left, and it worked for the whole project. So you really don't need that much. But I just glued each of the shells in place, and the nice thing is E6000 doesn't harden right away, so you can kind of finagle the arrangement. If you glue everything down and step back and say, oh, that one looks a little crooked, you can give it a little twist or adjustment after the fact. And then I also did the same thing with all of my sea glass pieces, just the tiniest dab of E6000 glue, and I secured every sea glass piece in place. I'm really liking these new sea glass slices from Dollar Tree. They're a lot thinner, easier to craft with than the bigger chunky ones. This project ended up looking a little too unfinished, so I went back and I added some nautical jute rope, and I'm so glad that I did. And I very simply just secured that all the way around the edge with hot glue. So I hot glued one end of the jute rope at the bottom of the cutting board, did a thin line of hot glue, worked in sections until I had wrapped the jute rope all the way around the cutting board, and then you cut off the tail end at the bottom and secure the two ends together. You kind of marry them up together. You could also cut the jute rope at an angle if you want like a smoother finish. But then that's it. Here's my little nautical sea glass and seashell specimen art. And I don't think it looks like it's made on a cutting board at all. So just grab some wood beads. These are from Dollar Tree. I got them a while ago. These are stained like a dark color, but they can be unfinished, whatever you got. So for this size of cutting board, my wood beads were about 2.5 centimeters in diameter, give or take. But all you're gonna do is just grab your hot glue gun and apply a little bit of hot glue to the bottom of each wood bead, and then apply it right to the edge of the cutting board. You really want to make sure that if there's going to be any hot glue that it pools towards like the center of the cutting board and not towards the outside, so you have a more finished look. So just kind of be careful. And if like you're going to apply more hot glue on one side of the wood bead, that part of the wood bead is what faces the inside of the cutting board. but just keep going all the way around the cutting board. I think I used 39 wood beads to go all the way around. And then once you have all those wood beads in place, it's time to add the second cutting board. So once again, applying more hot glue to the inner edge than to the outer edge of that wood bead, so you don't have hot glue pooling on the outside of your tray. Just run hot glue all the way around the tops of those wood beads and then set the second cutting board right on top, nice and centered. Easy peasy. And then it's time to add 4 little feet to the riser. And for this, I used 2-centimeter diameter wood beads. These were not from the Dollar Tree. They were from like the craft store. They were just in my craft stash, but use whatever you can find. And for this, I used a combination of E6000 glue for more permanent long-term hold and a tiny dab of hot glue for instant hold so I could paint this tray right away. So a little bit of both, and then set that wood bead right in place to serve as a leg on this riser tray, and then repeat the process with the other 3 wood beads. And then from here, it's time to paint. So I grabbed my trusty Waverly chalk paint in the color Moss. Use whatever color and brand of chalk paint makes you happy, and just give a nice good coat over the whole tray. So it does take a fair amount of time to get between all the nooks and crannies between the wood beads and everything, and it does take a couple coats, because like you'll do one coat and then set it aside and look at it from another angle and oh I missed a bunch of spots there. So just take your time and do a good coat, and then come back and do a second coat after the first one is dried. The nice thing is chalk paint dries pretty quickly. And then I also just did another coat right on top of my riser tray here with that same green, moss green Waverly chalk paint. And this final step is totally optional, but I just cut a stencil on my Cricut on like stencil vinyl. I really enjoy going into Cricut Design Space and picking out designs and making my own stencils, but you could use a store-bought stencil or just skip this step completely. You don't even need to do this at all, but I just set my stencil in place and used a pouncer brush with a combination of celery green chalk paint from Waverly and white chalk paint. The celery was like a little too dark, but I didn't want to do a bright white, so I kind of mixed the 2 colors together with a pouncer brush and kind of went over my whole stencil there. But use any type of like pattern stencil that you like, any color, any accent color paint you like, or like I said, skip this step altogether. And then once I peeled off my stencil, I let that chalk paint fully dry. So I like to peel off my stencils when the paint is still a little bit wet, so I'll let it sit for like 5-10 minutes, peel off the stencil, and then let it completely dry. And then just protect your surface with a quick clear coat of any type of like clear sealant. I like matte more than satin. That's just personal preference, but really any type of spray sealant or even a coat of Mod Podge would do. But that was it. Here's my little green painted riser tray along with a natural wood riser tray that I bought at the Target dollar spot a while ago. But a fun little trendy farmhouse style project for styling, you know, bookshelves or centerpieces or side tables or anything else that you like. For this project, you want to start with your cutting board and some wooden half balls. I just kind of dry fit them so I would know what background color to paint where. So I initially started with 5, 4, so 10, 18, and then I ended up only using 16. But I just use a pencil to mark kind of the boundary of where I wanted my wood bead star area to be. And then that way I knew what part to paint white and what part to paint blue. So I just used my 1-inch flat paintbrush and some white paint and painted all of the stripes area white. And I also painted the edge of the cutting board as well, just to give the finished project a more polished look. And then I went in with another 1-inch flat paintbrush and my blue paint, and I painted the stars area and then let that all dry.
And then I painted my little wooden half balls white, just tossed them in a Ziploc bag with a splash of water and some white paint, and then you give everything a real good shake up until everything is completely covered. And then to let them dry, you just pour them out onto a piece of parchment paper or wax paper just so they don't stick. Roll everything face up and then set them aside to dry. Now it's time to dry fit my stripes. You'll notice my stripes are cream and not red, but they will be red. But first we just have to measure, which pieces we want where. This is just a lace ribbon from Dollar Tree, but any type of ribbon works. I just used this because I didn't have a plain red ribbon in my craft stash and I didn't feel like going to the store to buy any, so I improvised. So dry fit all your stripes, get them cut to the length that you want, and then grab another piece of parchment paper, another 1-inch flat paintbrush, and some red paint and start painting your ribbon. So I used more of a pouncing motion, so if you have a pouncing brush, that would work great on this project as well. But just get full coverage on one side of all of your ribbons and then set them aside to dry. And then when it was time to pick up my ribbons, there were little dry pieces of paint hanging off the edges, so I just kind of gave them a little brush off with my fingers, not a big deal. Then set them all in place onto the flag. Then you'll also want to dry fit your little wood balls in place. I said before, I dry fit 18 and then I just felt like it looked too crowded. So I ended up removing 2. So I had 16, 4 rows of 4. So if it looked different in the finished project than here, that is why. Then it's time to just hot glue everything in place. Here I'm using my fine point hot glue gun, which is great for smaller projects and fine details like this. And I also have a silicone fingertip protector on my finger. Comes in really handy when you're gluing down the ribbons. But just hot glue each of those wood balls right in place there. And then for the ribbon, just the tiniest dab of hot glue, like 3 tiny dabs, left, middle, and right. And then on the larger stripes, maybe 4 little dabs of hot glue. And smooth those ribbons right down. And then it's time to hang your project. So I measured an inch and a half from each edge of the cutting board along the top there. Mark your little hole spot, and then I use this little pin vise tool. I ordered it on Amazon. It's really great for just small projects without having to bust out the power tools. You can drill your pilot holes there super easily. And then I just keep a packet of these screw eyes in my craft stash. They're great for, Christmas ornaments or any other hanging projects or hanging signs. And then twist that screw eye right into place. This bamboo is kind of a harder wood, so I ended up using my craft pliers to twist that hook eye into place. And then I grabbed some twine and some 1.5 centimeter wood balls. If your twine gives you a hard time like mine did, you can just grab a little bit of painter's tape, wrap it around the end of the twine, it'll keep it from fraying, and then you can just cut that painter's tape off when you're done. But I strung up, I believe, 16 wood beads onto my twine, and then you simply cut off that painter's tape and then run one end of the twine and double knot it on that screw eye, and then cut off the other end of the twine, run it through and tie it with the double knot on the other screw eye, and you have a little hanging sign.
For this craft, you'll want to start by just unwrapping $1 store bamboo cutting board, and we're going to stain it. So this is Folk Art Wood Tint in the color Walnut. It's a very dark shade, but we're going to weather it up a little bit. So because it's such a dark shade, and because bamboo doesn't soak up wood stain very well, you got to be very careful. Watch for drips, apply a very thin layer, and make sure you use very smooth brush strokes back and forth. When you're applying it, you can be a little bit more messy, but before you step back to let it dry, make sure all your brush strokes are perfectly smooth and you have nothing dripping on the edges of the cutting board there. I also stained the back of the cutting board just so that everything would have the same finish on both sides. And then I had this old metal clip. It was originally a fridge magnet. The magnet fell off. pink was not my color. So I just painted it with regular black chalk paint. I just used a paintbrush and I painted at all edges, or at all angles, excuse me. And I set it on a piece of parchment paper. Same with that cutting board. So if you have something that doesn't need to look perfect, you want to paint both sides real fast, set it on parchment paper. That way it doesn't stick. And then I just came back with this folk art matte paint in the color parchment. It's just a nice, beautiful cream. So any type of cream, or if you want to mix brown and white together, if you don't have cream, is fine. I was going to dry brush it, and it was just too stark of a contrast. So I used my little spray bottle, and I ended up mixing a bunch of water in with this, and really playing around and really whitewashing and weathering it instead of dry brushing. And then in the end, I took a paper towel and I wiped off any excess paint to give it really a nice weathered finish. And then I painted the edges and the back as well. And then to finish it off, I just used E6000 to secure that clip right back onto the cutting board. So far, this is holding really well. If it doesn't, I'll have to go back in and use my pin vise tool to screw in a small hole and screw the clip into place. But then here's my finished little mini clipboard. I think I might put a magnet on the back of this and stick it on the side of my fridge for grocery lists. I'm not quite sure yet. Okay, and that's it. If you're still here and you've made it all the way through all 15 of these crafts, thank you so much for watching. Here are all of them together in one spot. I had to split it up into 3 different cards because there's so many of them, but I'm so thrilled with how all these crafts came out, and I'm sure this is not the last time you will see me craft with Dollar Tree bamboo cutting boards. Until next time, happy making.